The transcript was 6 seconds long. That was the part Vessel Archivist Sane couldn't reconcile. Not the content. The content was almost beside the point now, but the duration. 6 seconds of audio, captured by a passive sensor relay on the outer ring of Conclave Station Meridian, and somehow that recording had ended up classified at the highest tier the interstellar conclave possessed. A classification level Sane hadn't even known existed until 48 hours ago, when a junior analyst had flagged it by accident while cross-referencing timestamp anomalies in the station's atmospheric log. 6 seconds. Sane played it again, watching the waveform spike on the display panel. A single human voice. No translation overlay, because the conclave's linguistic matrix still hadn't fully parsed the dialect, which was itself strange, because the matrix had processed 17,000 human speech samples in the past decade and claimed 94% comprehension across all documented variants. This recording defeated it. Not because the words were foreign, because the matrix kept insisting the speaker wasn't speaking in a human language at all. The vote had happened 23 days before that recording was made. Sane knew the vote intimately. Every archivist did. It was the kind of institutional moment that defined careers, shaped the teaching records of the next generation, became the pivot around which all future conclave policy would eventually rotate. The session of final determination, as it had been formally logged. Informal name, circulating through the corridors and mess halls and secondary communication channels of every conclave station within broadcast range. The humanity verdict. 17 species, 412 voting delegates, a deliberation period of 9 standard rotations. The result, unanimous. Humanity, designated emergent species class 7, home system cataloged as solar tertiary local designation Earth, was formally declared unworthy of conclave membership, unworthy of protected status under the Sovereign Covenant, and unworthy of continued resource allocation from the Expansion Assistance Program. The vote had taken 11 minutes to formally conclude. Nobody had expected the next 23 days. Pull the full atmospheric log, Sane told the analyst without looking up from the waveform. Not just the anomaly window, everything from the station in the 72 hours surrounding that timestamp. Archivist, that's approximately 400,000 data entries. Yes. A pause. The analyst, young, Velhari species, still carrying the instinctive hesitation of someone who had not yet learned that an archivist's requests were not suggestions, said carefully. The classification level on the original recording would technically require senior conclave authorization to expand the search scope. Sane finally looked up. Then get authorization, Sane said. Tell them Archivist Sane of the Historical Continuity Division believes the humanity verdict may have been based on incomplete information. Tell them exactly that. The analyst stared. That will cause significant disruption. Yes, Sane said again, it will. The first thing you need to understand about the humanity verdict is what the conclave actually believed they were voting on. Not what they were told, what they genuinely, institutionally, across 17 species and 4 centuries of accumulated interstellar political philosophy, believed. They believed they were closing a file. Humanity had been under observation for 63 standard years, roughly 2 human generations. The Conclave's Assessment Division had deployed 11 separate survey missions, accumulated 4.2 million data points, and produced a final summary document that ran to 800 pages in its compressed form. The conclusion of that document, reached independently by 3 separate analytical teams and cross-verified by the Conclave's predictive modeling network, was blunt. Humanity represented a net negative probability for galactic stability. Not because humans were violent. That was the part most people misremembered later when they tried to reconstruct how the vote had happened. Humanity's violence metrics were actually mid-range by galactic standards, lower than the Keth, considerably lower than the early period Davari. Violence alone would never have triggered a verdict. The problem was something the assessment division's lead analyst, a Trellian named Orvash, had described in the summary document's most cited paragraph. The human species demonstrates a consistent pattern of irrational decision-making under resource pressure that cannot be modeled by any existing predictive framework. They do not respond to scarcity with consolidation. They do not respond to threat with systematic de-escalation. They do not, in any documented case study, behave in the manner most likely to ensure their own survival. This is not aggression. It is something more concerning. It is fundamental unpredictability. A species that cannot be modeled cannot be safely integrated. That paragraph had won the vote. Not the casualty statistics, not the territorial disputes, not the weapons assessments. The unpredictability. 17 species had looked at humanity and concluded, with complete logical consistency, we cannot predict what they will do next, therefore they are dangerous. Therefore they must be removed from the equation before they become a problem we cannot contain. The vote passed, the file was marked closed. Then the humans found out. Sane had read the post-verdict report from the Conclave's Diplomatic Observation Corps 3 times before realizing something was wrong with it. Not wrong in the sense of falsified, wrong in the sense of incomplete. The report described humanity's reaction to the verdict in careful, measured terms: civil disruption, governmental emergency sessions, brief periods of social unrest. All the predictable responses of a species receiving bad news on an existential scale. What the report did not explain was why, 72 hours after the verdict was transmitted to Earth's orbital relay station, all 11 of the Conclave's passive observation probes in the solar tertiary system had simultaneously gone dark. Not destroyed, not disabled, dark. As in, still transmitting, still receiving power, still logging atmospheric data, but transmitting on frequencies that no longer matched the Conclave's receiving protocols. As if someone had reached inside every probe simultaneously and changed a setting that shouldn't have been accessible from the outside at all. The Conclave's technical division had logged this as an anomaly and flagged it for investigation. That investigation had been assigned a priority tier of 4, moderate concern, non-urgent, and placed in a queue that, given current workload, would have received attention in approximately 8 months. Then Station Meridian had received the 6-second audio recording. The priority tier had changed. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Priya Vasanthakumar, and she had not slept in 61 hours. This was not unusual. Priya had not slept in meaningful intervals since the day the verdict had come through, rendered in clean algorithmic text on the emergency broadcast channel that the Conclave apparently assumed humanity checked regularly. She had been in the middle of a shift briefing when the wall display had quietly, almost apologetically, populated with the words that had ended one version of history and begun another. Conclave Session Log 7714 Final, Resolution Unanimous. Humanity, unworthy, status, removed. The officer who had been speaking mid-sentence had simply stopped. The room had gone so quiet Priya could hear the ventilation system cycling. Someone, somewhere behind her left shoulder, had made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Priya had looked at the display for a long moment. Then she had said very quietly, "Okay, get me Admiral Chen." That was 23 days ago. She was standing now in a room that officially didn't exist on any station manifest, in a section of Earth's primary orbital platform that had been listed as under structural renovation for the past 4 years. The room smelled of recycled air, and something chemical she'd stopped noticing after the first week. Around her, 14 people were doing things that, if the Conclave's technical assessment teams had known about them, would have immediately elevated humanity from a closed file to an active emergency. They had found out about the probes 3 days ago, that their modifications had been detected, that someone on Conclave Station Meridian had pulled an atmospheric log. "How long do we have?" she asked. The man across the room, Dr. Yusuf Akefer, who had not slept either, who Priya suspected had stopped tracking time entirely as a personal coping mechanism, looked up from his display without expression. "Depends on whether they understand what they're looking at. And if they do." He considered this with the careful honesty that Priya had come to rely on like a structural beam. "Then we're about 3 days behind where we need to be." Here is what the Conclave did not know about the probes. The frequency modification, the thing the technical division had logged as an anomaly and flagged at priority tier 4, was not a hack. It was not interference. It was not an accident or a malfunction or a desperate act of vandalism by a species lashing out at the instruments of its own condemnation. It was a calibration. Humanity had spent 63 years knowing they were being watched. 63 years of conclave survey probes sitting in their solar system, recording, measuring, assessing. And for approximately 51 of those years, humanity had done something the conclave's assessment teams had interpreted as passive acceptance. They had ignored the probes. They had not ignored the probes. They had been learning them. Quietly, without announcement, across 4 administrations, 11 research institutions, and a classified program that officially did not exist within any governmental budget humanity had ever allowed the conclave to review. They had mapped every probe's transmission protocol, every frequency range, every data compression algorithm, every authentication handshake. They had built, in a facility in the Atacama Desert that appeared on satellite imagery as an atmospheric research station, the most comprehensive reverse engineering archive of conclave technology that had ever existed outside conclave space. The frequency modification was step 1. They had not changed the probes to go dark. They had changed the probes to listen to something different. Sane had the atmospheric log now. 400,000 entries, spanning 72 hours around the timestamp of the audio recording. Sane had built a filter, cross-referencing every entry flagged as anomalous, every micro-deviation in the station's standard readings, every signature that didn't match the baseline. There were 47 of them. 47 separate, distinct anomalies in a 72-hour window on a station that, in its last full operational year, had logged an average of 3 anomalies per month. Most of them were small, insignificant in isolation, a pressure variance in Corridor 7, a 1-degree temperature fluctuation in the eastern observation bay, a power draw irregularity in a secondary conduit serving the archive's tertiary data banks. Sane stared at the list for a long time. Then Sane pulled up the station's physical layout and began marking locations. The pressure variance, Corridor 7, the temperature fluctuation, Eastern Observation Bay, the power draw, tertiary data banks. Sane added markers for all 47 anomalies. When the map was complete, Sane sat back and looked at it for almost 2 full minutes without moving. The anomalies formed a path. A deliberate, careful, sequential path through Conclave Station Meridian, through its corridors, its access points, its security junctions, that led from the outer docking ring to the archive's most restricted section and back again. Someone had been on the station. Someone who had left only atmospheric traces, no visual record, no biometric signature, nothing the station's security systems had identified as a presence. Only air, moved by something that wasn't supposed to be there. Sane pulled up the 6-second audio recording again, played it again, watched the linguistic matrix fail again, watched it insist the voice was not speaking a human language. and suddenly understood why. The speaker wasn't speaking to the conclave. The speaker was speaking to someone else on the station, someone the conclave didn't know was there. The recording wasn't surveillance. It was an accident. "They know someone was here," HFY said. He wasn't looking up from his display when he said it. Priya, who had learned to read his voice the way some people read weather, felt the particular quality of that statement, the flatness of it, the careful neutrality, and knew immediately it was not a question. How long ago did they figure it out? About 6 hours. He finally looked up. "Sane is faster than we expected." "How much does Sane know?" HFY was quiet for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to be honest. "Enough to ask the right questions," he said, "not enough to understand the answers." Priya moved to the window, real glass, actual viewport, a luxury she'd insisted on when they'd set up this room, because she'd known there would be moments when she needed to see something real and looked at the stars. "Does it change the timeline?" "It accelerates it," HFY said, "by a lot." "By how much is a lot?" He said a number. Priya kept looking at the stars. A muscle in her jaw moved once. "All right," she said, "move to phase 2. This is the part that the conclave would later spend 11 years trying to fully reconstruct. In the 23 days between the humanity verdict and what the conclave's historical record would eventually label the Meridian incident, humanity had not been protesting, had not been negotiating, had not been broadcasting desperate appeals to the 17 species who had voted to remove them from the galactic equation. They had been building. The program had no official name. Internally, the people working on it called it different things depending on their department and their sense of dark humor. Priya's team called it the argument. HFY's team, with characteristic precision, called it the demonstration. The Admiral's office, which officially knew nothing about any of this, referred to it in the 3 documents that would later be discovered as simply the response. The response had actually begun 44 years ago. Not as a contingency plan for the humanity verdict specifically. At that point, the vote had not yet been conceived. It had begun as a contingency plan for the general category of situation. What to do if the conclave decided humanity was a problem to be solved rather than a species to be welcomed. The humans had started preparing for rejection before they'd even formally applied for inclusion. Not out of pessimism, not out of paranoia. Out of the specific kind of reasoning that the conclave's assessment team had identified correctly as fundamentally unpredictable, and had then, catastrophically, misclassified as irrational. It wasn't irrational. It was a form of logic the conclave had no framework to recognize, because no other species in its 4-century history had ever operated on timescales longer than the problem in front of them. The conclave planned in response to threats. The Trellians, the Velhari, the Keth, the Davari. Every member species built their contingency frameworks around identified dangers, visible on the horizon. Humanity had built a contingency framework for threats they couldn't see yet, against outcomes they couldn't predict yet, using resources they wouldn't have for decades. They had started building the response when it was still a thought experiment. By the time the vote happened, it had been running for 44 years. What the atmospheric anomalies on Conclave Station Meridian represented, what the quiet path through the archive's restricted section represented, was not an infiltration. It was a proof of concept. Sane had pulled the archive access logs now. Not the surface logs, those were clean, undisturbed, showing nothing. But Sane had found, buried in the archive's maintenance diagnostic record, a 3-millisecond gap in the data continuity of the restricted section's index file. A gap so small it would never have been noticed in routine review. A gap that indicated, to anyone who knew exactly what they were looking at, that something had read the index without logging the access. Someone had looked at the conclave's most restricted files. Not copied them, not modified them. Simply read their index, their table of contents, and then put everything back exactly as they found it. Sane sat with this for a long time. Why read an index? What did you learn from a table of contents that you couldn't learn from the documents themselves? You learned what existed. You learned what the conclave had chosen to keep hidden. And then Sane thought, if they read the index, they know what's in those files. They know what the conclave has documented about them. Every assessment, every survey report, every predictive model, every recommendation that led to the vote. They know exactly what we think of them. They know every assumption we made. Sane felt something then, something that the Trellian emotional register didn't have a precise word for, but approximated closest to the sensation of standing at the edge of something very tall and looking down and realizing the drop was significantly longer than previously believed. Sane opened a direct channel to senior conclave authority. This is Vessel Archivist Sane of Historical Continuity. I need to report a finding of significant concern. A pause. I believe humanity knew what the vote would be before we took it. I believe they have been preparing for it. And I believe their presence on this station was not an act of desperation. The channel was quiet. What was it, Archivist? Sane looked at the atmospheric map, at the 47 careful, invisible footprints leading to the archive and back. It was a message, Sane said. They wanted us to find this, not immediately, not obviously, but eventually. They wanted us to understand that they had been here, that they had read what we know about them, and that they had chosen to leave without taking anything or damaging anything. A beat. They were demonstrating restraint on purpose for us to find. Another silence, longer than the first. Why would they demonstrate restraint? Because, Sane said, and felt the vertigo deepen, the alternative interpretation, the one they want us to consider, is what they could have done instead, and didn't. The conclave's emergency session convened 16 hours later. Priya didn't know this. She was in the non-existent room on Earth's orbital platform, not sleeping, watching numbers on a display that represented things she couldn't afford to name too precisely, even in her own thoughts. What she knew was that HFY had been right about the timeline. They were moving faster than the original plan, faster than comfortable. Some components of the response had been designed with redundancy built in, tolerances for delay, margins for error. Phase 2 was burning through those margins. How many are operational? She asked. HFY didn't look up. 14. We need 22. I know. By when? He finally looked up. His eyes had the quality of someone who had done the math multiple times and gotten the same answer each time, and did not like the answer but had accepted it. If we pull the Atacama team and integrate their hardware directly, bypassing the testing protocol, he started. No. Priya. I said no. She said it quietly, which was how she said things she meant absolutely. The testing protocol exists because 3 people died the last time we skipped it. We don't skip it. HFY was quiet. Then 16, he said. 16 operational by the window. 16 is enough. The pause this time was its own kind of answer. It has to be, he said. The conclave's emergency session lasted 9 hours. Sane was not present. Archivists were not summoned to emergency sessions, only to provide documentation afterward. But Sane had sources, the way all archivists eventually develop sources, the quiet accumulation of debt and reciprocity that constituted institutional survival. What Sane heard from those sources was not reassuring. The session had not gone where most people expected. The initial reaction, the one that Sane had anticipated, the one that followed most logically from the evidence, had been toward escalation. Several delegates had argued that humanity's presence on Station Meridian however restrained, constituted a violation of the verdict's implied separation protocols, and that the appropriate response was to move the timeline for formal exclusion measures. But then the session had hit a problem. Nobody could agree on what the exclusion measures should actually be. Because the situation that Sane had uncovered didn't fit the framework. The verdict had been based on a model, the Comprehensive Assessment Division document, 800 pages of data and analysis, and that model had made specific predictions about how humanity would respond to rejection, civil unrest, technological stagnation, eventual acceptance. The model was confident. A species receiving a conclave verdict at humanity's developmental level would, within 2 standard years, either redirect its energies toward internal consolidation or collapse into factional conflict. Either way, the problem resolved itself. The model had not predicted this. One senior delegate, Velhari, one of the oldest serving members, someone whose opinion carried institutional gravity, had reportedly said something that stopped the session entirely. What Sane's source had transmitted was imprecise, filtered through 2 layers of second-hand recall, but the substance of it was, we modeled what they would do if they were afraid. We did not model what they would do if they were not. Priya had been awake for 82 hours when the signal came. She was sitting in a chair that had not been designed for extended occupation, holding a cup of something that had been coffee several hours ago and was now a sociological artifact, when Akafar straightened up across the room with a sharpness that cut through the ambient exhaustion like a current through water. "They're transmitting," he said. She was on her feet before the sentence finished. The transmission was on an open frequency, deliberately open, the kind of frequency selection that was itself a statement. Not the conclave's diplomatic band, not an emergency channel, the frequency humanity used for deep space general broadcast, the frequency that, 63 years ago, the conclave's first survey mission had discovered was already in use and had noted in its initial report as evidence of a species that talked to itself constantly, to no evident purpose. The conclave was calling on a frequency, designed to make absolutely certain that everyone could hear. The message was short, translated, even the linguistic matrix managed this one. It read, "To the human species and relevant governing authorities, the conclave has reviewed recent information and requests a direct communication session, non-adversarial, exploratory, expedient." Priya read it twice. "Expedient," she said. "They're worried," Akafar said. "About what specifically?" He hesitated, which was itself notable, because Akafar didn't hesitate about things he'd already worked out. "About what we haven't done," he said. "They found the station access, they found the probe modifications, they know we've been preparing, but they don't know what for." He looked at her directly. "They're scared of the blank space, the thing they can't see." "Good," Priya said, and the word came out with a weight to it that surprised even her. She looked at the numbers on the display, 16 operational, the window opening in 31 hours. "Tell them we're available to talk," she said, "in 40 hours. Sane was present for the response to that counteroffer. Not in the room, but the exchange passed through the conclave's communication system, and archivists had read access to communication logs as a matter of institutional record. Sane watched the timestamp of humanity's reply appear on the system. Read the content. Read it again. Available in 40 hours. Not 30, not 35, not the standard diplomatic protocol of accepting the offered timeline or proposing an alternate within a reasonable variance. 40 hours, unprompted, seemingly arbitrary. Sane thought about the 47 atmospheric anomalies, about the 3-millisecond gap in the archive index, about the probe modifications that had taken the technical division's best teams 4 days to partially understand and another week to give up on fully revering. About the Velhari delegates' reported words, We did not model what they would do if they were not afraid. 40 hours, why 40? Sane pulled up the communication log's metadata, cross-referenced it against the probe modification timeline, against the station access timestamp, against every data point the conclave had accumulated in the past 23 days. Sane found the pattern in 11 minutes. 40 hours brought the communication session to a specific moment. A moment that, in the conclave's own astronomical mapping database, corresponded to a precise alignment. A window, narrow and brief, when the communication lag between Earth's orbital platform and 12 specific relay points in the outer solar system would simultaneously reach their minimum latency point. A window when humanity could, theoretically, push a simultaneous signal to 12 locations at once with zero meaningful delay. 12 locations. Sane checked what existed at those 12 locations in the conclave's survey records. 11 of them were uninhabited, deep space coordinates, nothing of note. The 12th was Conclave Station Meridian. Sane stared at the screen for a very long time. Then opened the senior channel again, voice carrying a quality that the Trellian emotional register would have classified as controlled alarm. The 40-hour window is not diplomatic convenience, Sane said. They chose it because of what they can do in that moment. They want us to understand they chose it. They want us to know they know about our station positions. A breath. This is not a communication request. This is a demonstration. They are showing us the shape of something without showing us the thing itself. The senior channel was quiet long enough that Sane began to wonder if the connection had dropped. Then, what is the thing itself, archivist? Sane thought about 44 years, about the response, about a species that had begun preparing for rejection before the invitation had even been extended. I don't know yet, Sane admitted, but I believe that is precisely the point. The 16 units came online at hour 39. Priya watched the confirmation signals populate on the display, one by one, each one a thing that 3 years ago had existed only in theoretical models, and 10 years ago had existed only in a conversation between two people in a desert. Each one representing approximately 11 years of work, and a budget that had required more creative accounting than Priya preferred to think about. Akafar was running diagnostics. The room had filled up slightly, 7 additional people over the past 6 hours, drawn by the gravity of the moment, everyone quiet in the way that people went quiet when something large was about to happen, and all the preparation was done, and all that remained was the doing. All 16 nominal, Akafar said. Priya nodded. What's the window? 62 minutes, starting in 48 minutes. She did the math automatically. The communication session with the conclave was scheduled for hour 40. They would be in the middle of talking to the conclave when the window opened. That had not been an accident either. Priya, Akafar said. She looked at him. When they ask us what these are, he began. Tell them the truth, she said. He blinked. Of everything she could have said, she could tell that hadn't been on his list. Which truth? He asked carefully. That we built them because we were told we were unworthy, she said, and we wanted to understand what worthy looked like from the outside so we could build toward it ourselves. Without them, she paused. That's true. That's also, he said, only part of the truth. Yes, she agreed, but it's the part that matters first. The communication session lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds before the conclave's lead delegate, Senior Velhari, as Sane had expected, stopped speaking mid-sentence. Priya had been watching the Velhari's visual feed through the translation interface, had watched the careful diplomatic posture, the controlled professional distance, had watched all of it shift, abruptly, into something unguarded. You've already deployed them, the Velhari said. Not a question, not an accusation. An arrival at a conclusion. We deployed them 11 minutes ago, Priya confirmed. We wanted you to be present when it happened. That's why we asked for 40 hours. What are they? The voice had changed register. Sane, listening from the archive feed, noted the quality and would later spend considerable time trying to describe it accurately in the record. It was not fear. It was the voice of someone who had just realized the room they were standing in was much larger than the walls suggested. Transit anchors, Priya said. Silence. That's not, the Velhari stopped, started again. That technology is not within humanity's developmental classification. You are a Class 7 emergent species. Transit anchor construction requires 44 years, Priya said. Give or take, we started before you started watching us. Another silence, different quality to this one. You built transit anchors, the Velhari said slowly, before we made formal contact. We built the theoretical framework before contact. We started construction approximately 9 years after your first survey probe arrived. Priya's voice was level, not triumphant, something more complicated than triumph. We knew someone was watching. We didn't know who. We decided that if someone was watching, they might eventually decide whether we were welcome or not. We wanted to be ready for either answer. Sane, in the archive, pulled up the Conclave's technical database on transit anchors. Read the construction requirements. Read the resource specifications. Read the timeline estimates for a species at humanity's cataloged developmental level. The estimate was 90 to 120 years, minimum, with substantial external assistance. Humanity had done it in 44, alone, while being observed closely enough that the Conclave had 4 million data points on their civilization and had seen nothing. How? The Velhari said, and the word was small in a way that senior Velhari delegates' words were not typically small. We hid it, Priya said simply. For 44 years. We're good at working quietly toward things we care about. She paused. It's something we do when we're not sure we're welcome. Sane was still in the archive when the technical division released its preliminary analysis. 16 transit anchors, positioned at 11 uninhabited coordinates and one that corresponded. And here the analysis team had apparently needed to verify this 3 times before including it in the report, to a location approximately 14 light minutes from Conclave Station Meridian. Not threatening, not aimed, just present, the way a door is present in a wall. The 16 anchors, the analysis noted with the flat precision of people communicating findings they had not yet emotionally processed, were sufficient to establish a transit network that would give humanity instantaneous travel access to 11 deep space locations, and one position adjacent to the Conclave's primary regional hub. Humanity had not built a weapon. They had built a door. And then they had put one end of it next to the Conclave's house, and called to schedule a meeting, and waited to see what would happen. Sane read the analysis. Read it again. Then did something archivists did not typically do during working hours, walked to the viewport and stood looking at the stars for several minutes without any professional purpose. Because Sane was thinking about the vote. About 17 species and 412 delegates and 9 rotations of deliberation and 1 unanimous conclusion. Humanity was unpredictable. Humanity could not be modeled. Humanity's irrationality was a danger that could not be safely integrated. Every part of that conclusion was technically accurate. Humanity couldn't be modeled, that was true. Because the model had assumed that humanity's horizon matched every other species' horizon, the immediate future, the visible threat, the problem in front of them. The model had processed 63 years of human data and had never detected the 44-year project hiding inside it because the model couldn't conceive of a species planning for a rejection that hadn't happened yet, preparing for an exclusion they hadn't been threatened with, building toward a future they might never reach, not because they expected success, but because the alternative, giving up, had apparently not been a serious option. The conclave had called this irrational. Sane understood now that it was something much simpler and much more difficult to counter. It was patience weaponized. It was hope operationalized. It was a species that had decided, at some collective level below policy and above instinct, that the appropriate response to the possibility of rejection was not to seek approval more desperately. It was to quietly become the kind of species that didn't need approval and then show up anyway. Sane thought about the 6-second audio recording, about the linguistic matrix's failure to classify the speaker's voice, about the fact that the speaker had been talking to someone else on the station in a language the matrix didn't recognize. Not a human language. A language humanity had apparently invented, or adapted, or built from scratch for purposes that had nothing to do with the conclave or its databases or its 4 centuries of linguistic documentation. A language the conclave didn't have yet. Sane opened a new query and submitted a request to the communication division. Cross-reference all recorded human transmissions against the Meridian audio fragment. Specifically, identify if and when this language appears in any prior recording. The query returned in under a minute. 17 instances, all in the past 14 months. All on frequencies the conclave's monitoring systems had been watching, that had been logged as unintelligible static, that had been filed and forgotten because static was not a priority. 17 transmissions in 14 months, all in a language that didn't exist in any database. All occurring at the 12-point alignment coordinates that Sane had identified earlier. They had been coordinating across the solar system in a language built specifically so the conclave couldn't understand it for over a year. Sane stared at the query result. Then, how long have we actually had the Meridian recording? A pause from the system. 48 days, archivist. Not 23, not since the vote. 48 days. Before the vote. The recording, the 6-second audio fragment that had triggered the whole chain of investigation, that had cracked open the atmospheric log, that had led to the map and the archive access and the probe modifications and the transit anchors, had been made before the humanity verdict. Before the verdict was finalized. While the deliberations were still in session. Sane stood very still. Someone had been on conclave station Meridian during the deliberations, reading the archive index, learning the shape of what the conclave intended before the conclave had formally decided. And the 6-second recording, the accident, the thing Sane had assumed was a slip, the trace that had started all of this had been captured during that visit. Had been captured. Had been filed at the highest classification level available. Had been filed by the station's automated security system, which operated without human oversight, which logged and classified without political consideration. But the security system didn't determine its own priority tiers. Priority tier were assigned by the Security Division's Review Office, which had assigned this one a classification level that, as Sane had noted at the very beginning 48 hours ago, Sane hadn't known existed. Why would the Security Division assign maximum classification to a 6-second audio anomaly, even a suspicious one? Unless the Security Division hadn't assigned it at all. Unless the tier had been assigned by someone else. Unless Sane was already pulling the classification metadata, pulling the assignment record, pulling the authorization signature that had marked the recording at maximum tier, had buried it where only an archivist specifically looking for timestamp anomalies would find it. The authorization was logged under an internal station account. A maintenance diagnostic account that, per the station records, had not been actively used in 3 years. Sane looked at the creation date of that diagnostic account. Then looked at the timestamp of humanity's first known visit to the station, which Sane had established from the atmospheric log. The account had been created during that visit. Humanity had not only been on the station during the deliberations. They had classified the recording themselves. They had hidden the evidence of their own presence, but not completely, not forever. Hidden it just enough that it would take a specific, determined, methodical investigator to uncover it. Hidden it in a place where it would eventually be found. By the right person. At the right time. Sane sat down. Because the full picture had just arrived, and the full picture was this: humanity had not been caught. Every step of the past 48 hours, every discovery, every inference, every escalating revelation that Sane had believed was an investigation, had been a guided tour. Humanity had left the atmospheric traces, had left the archive gap, had left the frequency trail, had left the hidden classification. They had known that eventually a conclave archivist would pull a timestamp anomaly and start following the thread. Had known that thread would lead, step by careful step, to a complete picture of what humanity had built and how long they'd been building it and why and what they were prepared to do with it. They hadn't been hiding. They'd been waiting to be understood. Priya heard Sane's voice on the communication channel 9 minutes after the Velhari stopped speaking. Not the senior diplomatic channel, the archive channel, the one that was technically for documentation requests. Sane had found it somehow, or already had access, or Priya had stopped being surprised by the ways people found paths to the conversations they needed to have. Lieutenant Commander Vasanthakumar. The voice was careful, precise, carrying something underneath the precision that Priya recognized, because she had felt it herself 19 years ago in a desert facility when the first theoretical framework had become the first physical component. Archivist Sane, she said. You planned for us to find all of it. Yes. Why? Not a question. The kind of word that meant, I need you to say it out loud so I can record it accurately. Priya looked at the stars through the viewport. Because we knew what you thought of us, she said. We read the assessment, all 800 pages. We knew you thought we were irrational. We knew you couldn't model us. And we understood, genuinely understood, why that scared you. A pause. So we wanted to show you what the irrationality actually is. From the inside, we wanted you to see the whole shape of it, not just the edges. The transit anchors, Sane said. The anchors are the shape, Priya said. The 44 years are the irrationality. We built something we weren't supposed to be able to build, on a timeline that should have been impossible, for a future we weren't guaranteed to reach, against an outcome we couldn't predict, in secret from a civilization that outclasses us technologically by several centuries. That is irrational, Sane said quietly. Yes, Priya agreed. But here's the thing about irrational archivist. She turned from the window. Irrational means you can't model it. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. Silence. The vote, Sane said. The humanity verdict. You are asking us to reconsider it. We're not asking anything, Priya said. And something in her voice on that, something very quiet, very settled, the voice of someone who had stopped needing to be validated a long time ago, made Sane pause. Then what are you doing? We already rule our own path, Priya said. We built the anchors. We speak languages you don't have yet. We've been preparing for this conversation since before you knew we existed. She looked at the display, 16 green indicators, 16 units humming at coordinates humanity had chosen for themselves. We didn't come here to ask for your approval. We came here because we thought you deserved to understand what you voted against, and what you'll be sharing a galaxy with either way. The channel was quiet for a long time. So long that Akafar glanced at Priya with a question in his expression. She shook her head slightly, let it breathe. Then Sane said slowly, in the measured voice of an archivist assembling the first line of a record that would be read for centuries. The Council declared humanity unworthy 23 days ago. Yes, Priya said. What should I record as the official designation for this period? Sane asked. For the archive, for the historical record. What do you call what happened between the vote and now? Priya thought about the desert facility. About 61 hours without sleep. About Akafar's carefully honest pauses and 16 green indicators, and a 6-second recording that humanity had hidden inside the conclave's own station and waited for someone to find. She thought about every person who had worked on the response across 4 decades, most of whom had never expected to see it complete, who had worked on it anyway. We call it Tuesday, she said. The silence afterward was different. The conclave would not dissolve its vote that day, would not immediately revise its classifications or issue a formal reversal, or extend the membership offer humanity had never been given. Those things would come slowly, with all the institutional friction that 4-century-old political bodies accumulate like sediment. But they were not that day's gift. The gift that day was smaller and larger simultaneously. 17 species looking at the stars with a new question where a closed file used to be. And Sane in the archive, opening a fresh record and typing the first line of what would become the most read document in conclave history. Not because it was dramatic, not because it contained revelations that shook the foundations of galactic political order, though it contained both, but because of the way it ended. In the 23 days between their condemnation and this communication, the human species did not protest, did not despair, did not fragment, did not seek mercy. They completed a 44-year project. They transmitted in a language we had not yet heard. They were present in our archive and chose to leave it undisturbed. They built 16 doors and placed one of them next to ours. And when asked what they called the period of their own rejection, their representative said, Tuesday. The conclave voted on what humanity was. We had not yet asked what humanity intends. We should have started there. We will not make the same mistake about the species that comes after them.